The wellness check request came from a concerned neighbor on Monday morning at 9:15. An elderly couple on Maple Street hadn't been seen in 5 days. Their newspapers were piling up on the front porch. Their car hadn't moved from the driveway, and no one answered when neighbors knocked on the door. The couple had lived on the street for 30 years, never missed their morning walks, never let mail accumulate. Something was wrong. The deputy arrived at 9:40 and immediately noticed the details the neighbor had mentioned. 6 newspapers stacked by the front door, envelopes overflowing from the mailbox, curtains drawn across every window. The house sat in the middle of a quiet residential block, modest single-story homes with well-maintained lawns and mature trees. 30 meters down the street, a daycare center occupied a converted house, its playground visible from the couple's front yard. A sign out front advertised care for 60 children, ages 2 through 5. He knocked on the front door and called out, identified himself, waited for a response that didn't come. He tried the doorknob and found it unlocked, which immediately elevated his concern. He pushed the door open 6 inches and called out again, louder this time. From somewhere inside the house, he heard a voice, male, strained, telling him to stop, telling him not to come inside, telling him that everything was under control. The deputy froze. The voice didn't sound right, didn't carry the tone of someone who had everything under control. It sounded desperate, barely holding together. He keyed his radio and requested backup, explaining the situation in calm, measured words that didn't reflect the spike of adrenaline he felt. Something was very wrong inside this house. 2 more units arrived within 8 minutes. By then, the deputy had established communication with the voice inside. The man identified himself as the couple's son, said he was visiting from out of town, said everyone was fine and they just wanted privacy. But his words didn't match his tone, and when the deputy asked to see the elderly couple to verify they were okay, the man refused, said they were resting, said the deputy needed to leave, said he had a gun. The situation escalated from wellness check to potential hostage situation in the span of 15 minutes. The sergeant on scene called for the crisis negotiation team and established a perimeter around the house. Officers evacuated the 4 homes immediately adjacent to the couple's property, moving families out through back doors and side yards. But the daycare center presented a problem. 60 children were inside, 30 meters from a house where an armed man was making increasingly erratic statements. The decision was made to shelter in place. Moving 60 toddlers and preschoolers down the street would create chaos, would draw attention, might trigger the man inside to do something rash. The daycare staff locked all doors, moved the children to rooms on the far side of the building, away from windows facing Maple Street. They continued normal activities, story time and snacks, keeping the children calm and unaware that anything unusual was happening outside. The crisis negotiator arrived at 10:30 and took over communication with the man inside. Through patient conversation, over the course of 3 hours, a picture emerged of what had led to this moment. The man was 46 years old, had lost his job 4 months earlier, had exhausted his savings and faced foreclosure on his home. He'd come to his parents seeking help, but an argument had escalated. He'd grabbed his father's hunting rifle, intending only to make them listen, to make them understand how desperate he was. But then hours passed, and the situation spiraled beyond his control. Inside the house were 4 people. The elderly couple, both in their 70s, unharmed but terrified. The man's wife, who'd been with him when he came to visit. And the couple's 2 grandchildren, ages 3 and 7, who'd been staying with their grandparents for the weekend. The man had been holding them all at gunpoint for 72 hours since Friday evening, when the argument began. None of them had been allowed to leave, not even to answer the door when neighbors knocked. They'd survived on whatever food was already in the house, sleeping in shifts, the children crying intermittently until exhaustion took over. The negotiator worked to establish rapport, to understand the man's perspective, to find leverage that might convince him to release his family and end the standoff peacefully. The man talked about feeling worthless, about the shame of losing his job, about the terror of losing his home. He talked about his children's faces when he told them they might have to move, about his wife's disappointment, about his parents' judgment when he asked for money. The rifle had seemed like a way to make them understand, to force them to help. Now, it was the only thing keeping him from facing consequences he couldn't bear. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky. The daycare center's normal pickup time approached at 2:30. Parents began arriving to find police vehicles blocking the street, officers in tactical gear positioned behind cars and trees. A command post had been established in a neighbor's garage, and parents were directed there to wait while the staff brought children out in small groups through the back door, away from the house where the standoff continued. The evacuation of the daycare took 90 minutes. Each group of children was led down a back alley, through a neighbor's yard, to a parking lot 2 blocks away where parents waited. The children thought it was an adventure, a special game their teachers had invented. They waved at the police officers, excited by the presence of so many uniforms and vehicles. Their parents held them tight, understanding how close to danger their children had been, how thin the line was between a normal Monday and tragedy. By 4 o'clock, the block was nearly empty. Only the homes immediately adjacent to the standoff remained occupied, residents choosing to shelter in interior rooms rather than evacuate and potentially draw attention. The negotiator continued talking with the man, working through cycles of despair and anger, promises and threats, hope and hopelessness. The man's wife had been allowed to speak briefly, her voice breaking as she begged him to end this, to let the children go, to accept whatever consequences awaited him. The children were the negotiator's primary concern. The 3-year-old barely understood what was happening, but the 7-year-old was old enough to recognize the danger, to see the rifle in her father's hands, to hear the fear in her grandmother's voice. 3 days of captivity had already traumatized them in ways that would require years of therapy to address. Every hour that passed added to that damage. As evening approached, the negotiator shifted tactics. He stopped discussing the man's problems and started focusing on his children. Asked him to describe them, to talk about their favorite activities, their dreams for the future. Asked him to consider what this experience was teaching them about conflict, about desperation, about how adults handle problems. The man's responses became quieter, less defensive. He began crying. The tactical team had been in position since noon, snipers covering every window, entry teams ready to breach if the situation deteriorated. But the hope was always negotiation, a peaceful resolution where no one got hurt and the children walked out unharmed. Force was the last option, reserved for the moment when talking. At 6:15, as the sun began to set, the man's resolve started cracking. He talked about his daughter's upcoming birthday, about a science project his son was working on for school. He talked about missing 3 days of their lives, 3 days he'd spent pointing a gun at them instead of being their father. The negotiator sensed the shift and pressed gently, offering a path forward, outlining how the man could end this without anyone getting hurt. The front door opened at 6:42. The man's wife emerged first, carrying the 3-year-old, her hand holding the 7-year-old's. Officers moved immediately, surrounding them, guiding them to safety behind the armored vehicles parked in the street. Next came the elderly couple, moving slowly, leaning on each other for support. The grandfather's face was gray, stress and fear etched in every line. The grandmother couldn't stop crying, her hands shaking as officers helped her into a waiting ambulance. The man was the last to exit. He came out with his hands raised, the rifle left inside on the living room floor. He collapsed on the front porch, curled into a ball, sobbing. Officers approached carefully, secured him in handcuffs, and led him to a patrol car. He didn't resist, didn't speak, just kept crying as they placed him in the back seat. The house was cleared by the tactical team within 10 minutes. They found the rifle unloaded, the ammunition locked in a safe in the bedroom. The man had been holding his family hostage with an empty gun for the last 24 hours, too afraid to admit it, too far into the situation to find a way out. The discovery added another leg. The 4 hostages were transported to the hospital for evaluation. Physical injuries were minimal, dehydration and exhaustion mostly, but the psychological damage was profound. The elderly couple had spent 72 hours believing their son might kill them. The wife had watched her husband transform into someone she didn't recognize. The children had seen their father become a monster, a memory that would shape their understanding of safety. The investigation revealed that warning signs had been present for weeks. Friends had noticed the man's deteriorating mental state, his increasing desperation as unemployment stretched on and savings dwindled. His wife had urged him to seek help, to talk to a therapist, to find resources for people in crisis. But he'd refused, convinced that accepting help meant admitting failure, that showing vulnerability was weakness. The shame of financial ruin had been unbearable, but the shame of needing help had been worse. The district attorney filed multiple charges: kidnapping, false imprisonment, aggravated assault, child endangerment. The man's attorney argued for mental health intervention rather than incarceration, pointing to his client's breakdown as evidence of diminished capacity. But the severity of his actions, the duration of the hostage situation, and the presence of children meant leniency was unlikely. The trial took place 8 months after the standoff. The man had spent that time in jail, unable to make bail, separated from his family, who'd had no contact with him since that Monday evening. His wife attended the trial, but sat in the back, her face expressionless, as she listened to testimony about the 3 days she'd spent as a hostage in her in-laws' home. The children didn't attend, spared from reliving the experience in a courtroom. The elderly couple testified about the argument that began the ordeal. Their son had asked for $50,000 to save his house from foreclosure. They'd refused, not because they didn't have the money, but because they'd given him money before and watched him squander it. They'd offered to help him find cheaper housing, to assist with job applications, to support him in ways that didn't enable his poor financial decisions. He'd responded with rage, screaming accusations about their lack of love, their refusal to help when he needed it most. The man's wife described the moment he grabbed the rifle, the look in his eyes that told her something fundamental had broken inside him. She talked about the 3 days that followed, the constant fear, the careful navigation of his mood swings, the effort to keep the children calm while their father waved a gun around. She described the moment on Monday when they heard police outside, when her husband's face went from desperate to terrified, when she realized the situation was about to get much worse before it got better. The grandfather testified about the conversations he'd had with his son during those 72 hours. Attempts to reach the man he'd raised, to find the boy he'd taught to fish and throw a baseball. His son had been there in glimpses, breaking through the desperation and rage in moments of clarity. But those moments never lasted, and the man with the gun would return, full of resentment and hurt and shame that had festered for years. The jury deliberated for 6 hours and returned guilty verdicts on all charges. The judge sentenced the man to 18 years in prison, with mandatory mental health treatment and no possibility of early release. The sentence was harsh but reflected the gravity of holding 4 people, including 2 children, hostage for 3 days. The judge noted that while the man's mental state was a mitigating factor, it didn't excuse the terror he'd inflicted on his own family. The man's wife filed for divorce 2 weeks after sentencing. She'd stood by him through unemployment, through financial crisis, through the early signs of mental health deterioration. But she couldn't reconcile the man she'd married with the one who'd held their children at gunpoint for 3 days. The children needed stability and safety, and he could no longer provide either. She moved to a different state, changed her name and the children's names, started over in a place where nobody knew about the hostage situation or the trial. The elderly couple sold their house and moved into a retirement community across town. They couldn't live in the home where they'd spent 30 years after what happened there. The living room where their son had paced with a rifle, the bedrooms where they'd slept in shifts for 3 days, the kitchen where their grandchildren had cried for their mother. Every room carried memories that made normal life impossible. The daycare center installed additional security measures in response to the incident. Cameras covering every approach to the building, reinforced doors that could be locked from inside with a single button press, a direct line to the sheriff's department for emergency situations. Parents had been understanding about the shelter-in-place decision, but the center's director knew how close they'd been to disaster. 30 meters had been the distance between 60 children and a man with a gun. The neighbors who'd called for the wellness check struggled with guilt, despite reassurances that they'd done the right thing. If they hadn't called, the man might have released his family after 3 days and no one would have known. Or he might have done something far worse, pushed past his breaking point into violence that couldn't be undone. There was no way to know, no alternate timeline to compare against reality. They'd made the call, and the situation had ended with everyone alive. The crisis negotiator who'd talked the man down received commendations for his work. 9 hours of careful conversation, building rapport with someone in crisis, finding the words that reached through desperation and brought 4 hostages home safely. But he didn't feel like a hero. He felt like someone who'd spent 9 hours trying to convince a man not to destroy his own family, and barely succeeded. The line between success and tragedy had been impossibly thin. The sheriff's department analyzed the incident in detailed after-action reviews. What had gone right? What could have been handled better? What lessons could be applied to future crisis situations? The decision to shelter in place at the daycare was reviewed extensively. Experts brought in to evaluate whether evacuation would have been safer. The consensus was that the on-scene commander had made the right call, that moving 60 small children past a house with an armed man inside carried greater risk than keeping them secure in place. The man served 4 years before his mental health deteriorated to the point where he could no longer function in general population. He was transferred to a psychiatric facility within the prison system, where he remained under heavy medication and constant supervision. His ex-wife never visited, and his parents came only twice before deciding that maintaining contact caused more pain than closure. His children didn't visit at all, too young to understand where their father was, old enough to remember what he'd done. The 3-year-old, now 7, barely remembered the hostage situation. Therapists had worked with her immediately after, helping her process the experience before it could solidify into trauma. She had vague memories of being scared, of staying in her grandparents' house longer than planned, but the details had faded with time and professional intervention. Her older sibling wasn't as fortunate. The 7-year-old, now 11, remembered everything. The look in her father's eyes, the weight of the rifle in his hands, the fear in her grandmother's voice. Years of therapy had helped her understand that her father's actions weren't her fault. That mental health crisis could make people do terrible things, that loving someone didn't mean forgiving everything. But understanding didn't erase the memories, didn't make her feel safe when men raised their voices, didn't stop the nightmares that still came occasionally. The elderly couple never fully recovered from the experience. The grandfather died 3 years after the standoff. A heart attack, the doctor said, was likely accelerated by stress and trauma. The grandmother lived another 2 years, spending her final months in assisted living, her mind increasingly clouded by dementia that might have been accelerated by the 3 days she'd spent as a hostage in her own home. She died without ever seeing her son again, without ever resolving the complicated mixture of love and fear and disappointment that defined their final interactions. The house on Maple Street was sold to a young family who didn't know its history. The realtor had no legal obligation to disclose what happened there, and the previous owners had wanted a clean break. The new family lived there for 2 years before a neighbor mentioned the standoff, described the police presence and the tactical teams, and the man who'd held his family hostage. They moved out within a month, unable to feel comfortable in rooms where such darkness had unfolded. The daycare center thrives, enrollment actually increasing after the incident, when parents saw how well the staff handled the crisis. The director still thinks about that Monday, about the decision to keep 60 children in place 30 meters from an armed man. She'd been right, the experts confirmed it, but the what-ifs still haunt her. What if the man had opened fire? What if he'd noticed the daycare and decided to involve more hostages? The distance between safety and catastrophe had been 30 meters and a series of decisions that could have gone differently at any point. The sheriff's department added a mental health crisis specialist to their staff, recognizing that many calls involve people in psychological distress rather than criminal intent. The specialist accompanies deputies on wellness checks, domestic disturbances, any situation where mental health might be a factor. The goal is intervention before crisis, resources before desperation, help before someone reaches the point where a rifle seems like the only way to be heard. The street returned to normal, or at least a version of normal. Newspapers are delivered, children walk to school, neighbors wave to each other across well-maintained lawns. But residents who were there that Monday remember the police vehicles, the tactical teams, the slow hours when nobody knew if the situation would end peacefully or in tragedy. They remember how close their quiet street came to becoming a crime scene, how thin the line is between ordinary life and catastrophe. The man remains in the psychiatric facility, his sentence having another 14 years to run. His ex-wife remarried, gave her children a stepfather who provides stability and safety, rebuilt a life that doesn't include fear or desperation or guns. His parents are gone, and his children have been encouraged to think of him as someone who was once part of their lives but isn't anymore. It's easier than explaining the complexity of loving someone who hurt them, of missing someone who made them afraid. The negotiator still works crisis situations, still spends hours on the phone with people at their breaking points. He thinks about the man from Maple Street sometimes, about the 9 hours they spent talking, about how close they came to an ending that would have destroyed multiple families. He wonders if earlier intervention could have prevented the crisis, if someone had recognized the warning signs and connected the man with resources before desperation turned to violence. The case file sits in archives, referenced in training sessions for crisis negotiators and tactical teams across the state. It's studied as an example of successful de-escalation, of patience and rapport building, and finding the right words at the right moment. But those who were there, who spent 9 hours not knowing if 4 hostages would walk out alive, don't think of it as a success. They think of it as a near miss, a situation that could have gone horrifically wrong and didn't only because of luck and skill in equal measure. Maple Street looks peaceful now. The house has new owners again, a retired couple who know the history and decided they could live with it. The daycare center still operates, though with enhanced security that serves as a daily reminder of that Monday. The neighbors still call in wellness checks when something seems wrong, but they carry the knowledge of what those calls can uncover. How routine concern can escalate into crisis in the span of hours. The deputy who responded to the initial call transferred to a different division after 2 years. He couldn't drive down Maple Street without remembering the moment he opened that front door, heard that strained voice, realized a wellness check had become something far more serious. Every call after that carried the weight of possibility, the knowledge that any door might open onto crisis, that any voice might belong to someone at their breaking point. The lesson, if there is one, remains uncomfortable. Mental health crisis can turn anyone into someone their family doesn't recognize. Economic desperation can push people to actions they'd never have imagined. And shame, the unwillingness to seek help, can transform personal struggle into family tragedy. The man on Maple Street had needed help for months before he grabbed that rifle. Multiple people had seen the signs, offered resources, suggested intervention. But shame had kept him from accepting it, and shame had ultimately led him to hold his own children hostage for 3 days. The community learned to watch for those signs, to offer help without judgment, to understand that mental health crisis requires the same urgent response as physical injury. The sheriff's department learned to treat wellness checks as potential crisis situations, to approach with preparation and resources rather than assumptions about what they'll find. And families learned that asking for help isn't weakness, that accepting intervention isn't failure, that the cost of refusing assistance can be measured in trauma and years and relationships that never recover. Maple Street carries its history quietly now, visible only in the enhanced security at the daycare, in the memories of residents who were there, in the case file that trains negotiators for situations they hope they never face. The house stands ordinary among ordinary houses, its dark secret known only to those who look closely enough to see past the well-maintained lawn and fresh paint. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, neighbors still think about that Monday, about how close they came to tragedy, about the 4 people who walked out alive because one negotiator found the right words and one desperate man decided to listen.